Blog Talk Radio.
And coming to you from the Blog Talk Radio studio in the heart of Hudson County. Folks, you know it's always in Union City and in Weehawken collectively. This is Working the Marks. And I am New Jersey's premier journalist, Fernando Uribe, and my partner in crime here is New Jersey's premier wrestling analyst, the great Patrick Rivera. What's up, PR?
Hello, sir. It is I, the premier wrestling analyst, the man who's more handsome than 10 movie stars. Slick back hair, ready to chop it up. Under unfortunate circumstances, Professor, the wrestling world lost a legend.
Yes, he did. And again, for everyone tuning in here, folks, if you haven't checked out recent episodes of Working the Marks, I don't know what you're waiting for, but always they're available free of charge. You can download them and listen to them anywhere and anytime by going to www.blogtalkradio.com/workingthemarks. Shoot us an email in our inbox. We definitely look forward to getting emails from our great listeners about what you like, about the show, what you don't like, maybe some guests you want us to try to get on the show to interview. Anything else, write to us, workingthemarks@gmail.com. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at working_the_marks. And, of course, on Twitter, follow us at working_marks. And as Patrick said, it is a somber week for us pro wrestling fans. For those of us especially who grew up watching and loving the Attitude Era, the passing of Scott Hall this week certainly leaves a void for us. And Pat, I'm a little older than you, and I remember watching Scott Hall really, kind of cut his teeth in professional wrestling back in the early 80s. When he was in, Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association promotion out of Minneapolis, the AWA. I was fortunate to see him and the late Curt Hennig capture the AWA tag team titles when they were relatively babies in the business. And, that was a solid babyface team back in the day. And, Scott Hall was a guy that, was very talented. You could see it early on from his AWA days. Eventually he transitioned into the National Wrestling Alliance at the time, then owned by the Crockett family. And it was a look that we weren't really used to. It was kind of like a light blondish hair, a very thick mustache. He looked like Ned Flanders from The Simpsons almost. But he had that build. He had that solid look that you wanted in a guy. He was someone that you could tell was going to be, someone in wrestling. You may not have noticed it in the mid to late 80s in the National Wrestling Alliance, but certainly when he left there, obviously had a little bit of a stint during the transition from the NWA to WCW, World Championship Wrestling. He was then repackaged as the Diamond Stud. He shaved, slicked his hair back, wore overalls, was managed by Diamond Dallas Page. And, that was a pretty good run for him. He was in some solid main events during WCW. But really what put him on the map is when he decided to leave Atlanta and travel north to Stamford, Connecticut, and work for Vince McMahon. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. He was a fantastic worker the entire time. Getting back to the mustache thing, they said they used to call him Tom Selleck with muscles. That's what they called him, because he resembled Magnum P.I., which was a very popular show back in the 1980s, as we remember. But some of our listeners might not know that, so I just wanted to shed a little light on that. Some of the work that he did at the AWA, particularly with Curt Hennig, where Curt Hennig served as a mentor to him, being that Curt had a little bit more time in the business and obviously came from a wrestling family, he really helped Scott Hall develop his ability as a worker, his understanding of the business, and obviously as tag team champions, they were able to improve upon that. His time at WCW was, decent, nothing incredibly memorable, but obviously outside of his work in his second stint at WCW, really Razor Ramon was the character that we all remember and remember Scott Hall as. And obviously he had fantastic matches and some great moments, some memorable moments, and really was one of the first guys to really create some WrestleMania moments. And one of them being the infamous ladder match at WrestleMania 10 against the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, which to this day is one of the standards in regards to ladder matches.
No, absolutely. And again, I think when he left Atlanta and he went to the then WWF, Vince McMahon repackaged him as pretty much like the reincarnation of Tony Montana, the iconic character in Scarface, which we all love the way Al Pacino played him. And, Vince McMahon got us to believe he was this Cuban guy from the Hialeah parts of Miami, with the gold chains, the kind of hairy chest, the very bright short sleeve, Guayabera shirts almost. I'll never forget a promo. He was somewhere in a really ghetto area of Miami, and he's just sitting on the porch talking to kids and just, exerting that accent that we all came to love, Oye, me chico, and all those great lines he had. And let's be honest, it was also a time when, again, Vince was transitioning away from the old guard, right? From Hogan, from Macho Man, from the Warrior per se, right? As Vince was sort of, kind of pushing smaller guys. And not to say Scott Hall was a small guy. He was a big guy. He was like 6'2", I think. Maybe a little bit taller. But the bottom line was that, you started seeing new blood that Vince was pushing, right? Brett was now a singles champion. He was the WWF champion. You saw Shawn Michaels, become the Intercontinental champion. And at the same time, what did Vince do? He brought him in during a time when Macho Man Randy Savage was during his second stint as WWF champion during the summer '92. And sure enough, Razor debuted and kind of distracted him and kind of interfered and helped Ric Flair win his second WWF championship. And that started the feud between, Macho Man Randy Savage and the guy oozing machismo, Razor Ramon. So I thought it was a great way for Scott Hall to come in and work with someone like Randy Savage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way he brought him in was fantastic. The character itself was incredibly unique. I know during the week when we were off the air messaging, we were talking, about a list that I had put together of the top 10 all-time greatest workers. And I had Scott Hall above a lot of people. I had him in at number 6, and for a variety of reasons. One of them, the biggest for me, was this guy literally had people convinced that he was Cuban. I mean, he had people convinced that he was Cuban. And, this is, Irish-American guy, you know what I mean? And everybody bought into it because his character work was so good. He helped improve a lot of people. He helped Shawn Michaels tremendously, which, for all you listeners out there, you could take a look at Peacock, WWE Network, and they had the Razor Ramon documentary on there, which was really, really fantastic. Gave us a lot of insight as to what he was like. Obviously, a lot of the personal stuff, but really more so a lot of the wrestling stuff, which was really, really important. I mean, and, by many actually, Shawn Michaels is considered the greatest worker of all time, the greatest wrestler of all time. And Scott Hall was instrumental in helping him get there. At one part, Scott even told him, he said, Shawn, stop trying to work like a heel. Stop with the punch and the kick stuff. Be you, be natural, be cocky. And once he gave him that advice, Shawn really, kicked it into another gear. And not just him, but Kevin Nash, even Sean Waltman as well, Triple H, who was also a Click member. So, I mean, his influence, his understanding of the business, I feel at times gets really understated. But just the character work, the way he came in, immediately working, top guys on the card, his ability to be able to adapt, his ability to be able to make anything work. I mean, these are signs of a true worker, and Scott Hall certainly was that.
No, he certainly was. And again, as he came in, he was feuding right away with Macho Man Randy Savage, a great guy to learn from, a guy who was a perfectionist in the ring. That was certainly a great feud. Obviously, as we moved on into 93, 94, his first WrestleMania appearance was in Las Vegas against former WWF World Champion Bob Backlund. I think a lot of people forget about that that match at WrestleMania in Las Vegas. Everyone's so, thinking about, Brett and Yokozuna and The Undertaker and Giant Gonzalez and Money Incorporated against the Mega Man. People forget that was Scott Hall and Bob Backlund, and that was a pretty good match, considering two good workers.
Yeah.
We all know the year after at WrestleMania 10 at Madison Square Garden, that ladder match set the standard for ladder matches between him and Shawn Michaels. And it was, from that point on, you could tell Vince trusted him. Again, the Intercontinental Championship has always been revered as probably the most prestigious secondary championship in promotions. And, to me, we looked at, the premise of Vince trusting him and really, putting that belt on him a few times. Obviously he beat Shawn to become the undisputed, Intercontinental Champion at Mania. He lost it subsequently, I think about a month later, to Kevin Nash, who would be Diesel, obviously Shawn's bodyguard. And for the rest of '94, there was kind of a back and forth. It was him and Nash fighting over the IC belt. Same thing, and he would get it back at SummerSlam in '94. Another iconic moment, right, Patrick? Walter Payton, SummerSlam in Chicago, the United Center's first ever event. And sure enough, there's Razor Ramon with sweetness, with Walter Payton, arguably one of the greatest running backs in NFL history there, and he reclaimed the title. He then, obviously it seemed like every Royal Rumble for the next 2 years, he would drop it to somebody. He dropped it to Goldust. He would drop it to Jeff Jarrett. It was kind of funny at some point where he was just dropping those belts at those pay-per-views, but he was always a good secondary champion for Vince. He was a solid worker. I think you can kind of make the case he was one of those guys that, Vince never, for whatever reason, I know there was a pecking order when it came to Nash and Shawn and Brett or whatever. It just seemed like he was probably a guy that had all the looks, checked off a lot of boxes, and probably could have been a good WWF champion. He drew as an IC champion. I was kind of disappointed Vince never put the belt on him, but, again, who am I? I've never booked anything other than 2K on my PlayStation, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, you've never drawn. You can't even draw a picture. But, it is what it is. Unfortunately, these things kind of happen in the business. I mean, we could sit here all day and argue about who should have been a champion and who wasn't, or who should have never been a champion. But, obviously he was really good at the role that he was at. And I know in previous episodes of Working the Marks with Fernando and Pat, which you can also find on Blog Talk Radio, we have discussed, or I have discussed, the term trusted worker, and describing some of the guys that Vince uses now, namely like Kevin Owens, Seth Rollins, Sami Zayn, et cetera, et cetera. Those are guys that Vince has the utmost faith in. And Scott Hall was one of those guys, one of those trusted workers. I mean, they don't pair you with a celebrity. They don't have you do anything with a celebrity if they can't trust you. If they don't feel like you're dependable or you're going to do it well, they're not going to put you in those situations. So Scott Hall was definitely a guy that was trusted. Maybe he could have been world champion. We don't know. But I just think Vince was kind of the belief that, like, hey, I got a really good thing going with this guy, and let's see where we end up with it.
Oh, no, I'm with you. And again, he was a guy that you could tell Vince trusted. Certainly, and again, I kind of got them reversed. In '95, he lost the Intercontinental title to Jeff Jarrett, and then in '96 he lost it to Goldust, a.k.a. Dustin Rhodes. But along the way, drew a lot of money. Those Razor Ramon, those bright yellow shirts, we always knew that they sold. Again, whether it was like the Razor styrofoam, pointer fingers, or the razors themselves. I mean, he drew gate, and he was a guy that was big on merch. Obviously, fans loved to, let's be honest, in the early '90s, the reason people like toothpicks and like to flick toothpicks is because of Scott Hall. He made it cool to be.
I still do it.
Absolutely, and he was a guy that made it cool to be a villain per se early on, and then obviously when he became a face, Vince kept him at that, and I think he was again very dependable. Drew, a guy that was paired up with a lot of main event people, but at some point, like everybody else, it's a business. In the spring of '96, it's been well documented that Scott Hall's contract was coming to an end. He spoke with Vince, and Vince wasn't willing to pay him what he was looking for. Down south, Eric Bischoff, who had just been really, who had taken over WCW in the last about 3 or 4 years, was having the luxury of Ted Turner money. And, he saw an opportunity to snatch some young talent. And Scott Hall, again, at that time was still relatively young in the business, still very active, very mobile. And, hey, listen, I was watching it. I posted it on my Instagram this week, on my Facebook, on my Twitter. Sure enough, Vince and him couldn't come to an agreement. Bischoff gave out a guaranteed contract to Scott Hall, of course, that Kevin Nash will get to in a minute. But everyone remembers that Monday night, Memorial Day, May 27, 1996. I'll never forget the match. It was Steven Dahl against the Mauler, former Mike Enos, if anybody remembers the Beverly Brothers, back from the early 90s in WWF. And sure enough, there's a guy in denim jeans, a denim vest with, his chest hair sticking out.
No T-shirt. No T-shirt. You don't need a T-shirt.
Yeah. No. And he came out, grabbed a mic, and cut the promo that we all knew, that said, hey, you want to go to war? You want a war? Well, you're going to get one. And he had still the Razor Ramon accent. And I'll tell you right now, man, back in 1996, again, this is really the internet was in its infancy. We didn't have Instagram or social media or YouTube yet. No one was spoiling anything. People really, really thought, wow, this is the closest we're going to come to WWF versus WCW. It was like suspending disbelief, like this is going to happen. And I think that's what made that promo so iconic, because now it gave fans that hunger of, wow, what's going to happen now? Is this really going to transpire? And I think that changed the business forever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most historic moments in the business. And it was really, I think one of the first times where like people were wondering, like, is this real? Like what's happening? And it was great. It was awesome. It was a fantastic way to debut the character. So many questions, but just an absolutely iconic moment in wrestling, which Scott Hall and iconic moments are pretty synonymous. So yeah, it was just a fascinating way to debut him, and obviously everything that transpired after, only added to it.
Well, absolutely. And again, we saw the slow, organic marinating of a couple weeks later. What happened? Kevin Nash showed up, and that rocked the wrestling world. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. First Razor Ramon and now Diesel on WCW Monday Nitro. And certainly, that started the entire, let's have your 3 guys against 3 of us. And we all know on July 7, 1996, hey, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, batted leadoff, but we all know who came into the back cleanup. And, turning Hulk Hogan, from a face to a despicable heel, I think changed the wrestling landscape, let's be honest. And Scott Hall, again, was instrumental in that. His promos were unbelievable, along with Kevin Nash leading up to Bash at the Beach. Everyone remembers even weeks before that during the Great American Bash, coming out and, just taking Eric Bischoff and beating him up and jackknifing him onto a table. It was iconic. Like, you wanted to watch Nitro every single Monday night because you didn't know what was going to happen. And I think, hey, credit to Eric Bischoff. Sometimes you catch lightning in a bottle. Sometimes you step in, feces, as the phrase goes, and you just make something out of nothing. Bischoff did. Bischoff was able to roll with this. And let's be honest, in 1996, you were watching Nitro a hell of a lot more than you were watching WWF Monday Night Raw.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a more compelling program. For us smart fellows, we used to double record. I would record Raw in my parents' room or Nitro, depending upon which one had the better main event or the better, more compelling program. And then I'd record on the old VCR and the other TV in the living room. But yeah, it was absolutely special. And Eric Bischoff, I know he gets a lot of flack. I've said my fair share of bad things about Eric Bischoff. But the guy, hearing him speak recently, he's incredibly intelligent. You could tell. And I was wrong about him, 100%. I'll admit it. But for him to do what he did and to have the foresight that he did, to be able to make that happen is really, really special. And I got to be honest, I mean, that Hogan turn, I mean, that was the biggest wrestling moment right then and there. That was really, really huge because the big hero.
Well, let's be honest. Right before that heel turn, I mean, the closest thing, and again, it's not even close to it, but the only heel turn we can remember in our lifetime really was Andre turning on Hogan in 1987. And that was, again, at the time of the business, Andre the Giant for 15 years was undefeated, was always a baby face, almost, as the phrase goes, a white meat baby face, beloved by the fans, never did anything heelish. But when he turned on Hogan, that was pretty big. That was huge.
Yeah.
And even, you can make the case during that same era, Roddy Piper, who was the most despicable heel in the business, went and became a beloved babyface. So it was kind of a weird transition there during that time in the late 80s. But Hogan's heel turn at Bash at the Beach, I mean, let's be honest. For those of us that watched, because we had those cable boxes, because I don't know about you, Pat, but I was not paying $29.95 every month for both a WWF pay-per-view, which was either in your house or...
Wait, hold on a second. Can Vince retroactively sue us, or can the FBI retroactively get us? Is there a statute of limitation on this?
I believe...
Because I don't know if I want to admit to this now.
I believe that's expired, so I don't think the FBI, who's probably tuned in right now, can do anything. But, again, it was one of those things where, those scramblers came in handy for us because, let's be honest, the last full calendar year before Bash at the Beach 96, I mean, there was a pay-per-view every month between WCW, between WWF. Well, ECW didn't really start until the late 90s, maybe 98, 99. But the scramble box came in handy.
Fairly legal.
Yeah, it came in handy. And sure enough, on that Sunday night when Hogan turned, you know what? Vince could have resurrected Christ for all we know. The next night, that was not going to beat out what people tune in tonight show. Just see, wait a minute. Hogan turned heel, and the Outsiders, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash are doing this with him? Like, that just set the table for the rest of 1996. And it's really what kind of put Vince McMahon behind the 8 ball for the rest of the year. While Vince was putting on quality wrestling, it didn't matter. All anybody cared about was that black and white NWO T-shirt, which sold like hotcakes.
Absolutely. It still does to this day. It's still like the number 3 best-selling top seller for WWE.com and their shop. I mean, that whole thing was just so huge. And actually, Hogan has actually been pretty vocal about how he was kind of down when he turned. He had kind of felt like, his act is stale and people aren't going to buy it and this and that. And Scott Hall kind of talked to him, and Scott Hall said, hey, we're working with you. We're working with Hulk Hogan. You're the biggest name in wrestling, so we got you, man. Just be you, be heinous, be you. And, Hogan really took the advice and ran with it and created a fantastic heel persona to go along with that NWO black and white. But that initial NWO, I mean, when it was just...
By the way, Scott Hall was also integral in helping reshape another wrestler's legacy who also was getting stale at the time. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But Scott Hall was absolutely instrumental, a great creative mind, too, for the business.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that whenever someone passes away, people like to, say, oh, they were a trailblazer, they were great, they were this, they were that. They throw around all these different things. But I'm telling you, anybody who watched wrestling during that time, anybody that stepped between those ropes and wrestled inside that ring, they could tell you that Scott Hall was fantastic at what he did. His selling, his facials, his promos, everything that he did. He some guys would have to go in there and hit 5 moves to get the same kind of response that he would literally get from a punch and a pose because the guy was that good. And sometimes he didn't even have to throw the punch. He would just pose, and he would get that kind of pop because he just knew how to work a crowd. And he was, a truly, truly special talent. And obviously, created some great memories, for the rest of his time in WCW.
No, absolutely. And again, I think what people forget during '96, obviously Hogan's heel turn, not even arguably, undisputedly, the most prominent heel turn in the history of the industry. No one's even come close to that. And what people forget as well is while Hogan, got back on top in the wrestling world, being a heel, reclaimed the WCW world title later that summer at Hog Wild in Sturgis, South Dakota, people forget that just a couple months later at Halloween Havoc, which again was one of WCW's prominent pay-per-views. Vince, early on always had the big four, Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, SummerSlam, Survivor Series. People forget in WCW's heyday, Halloween Havoc was one of its marquee pay-per-views along with Starrcade, Super Brawl, and the Great American Bash. And sure enough, during Halloween Havoc, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash captured, again, it was a wave of momentum and popularity. And sure enough, while Harlem Heat was as good a tag team at that time in the business, sure enough, Scott Hall and Nash went over on them. And, that was an incredible run as a tag team where, let's be honest, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash made their money for a lot of years as singles wrestlers, but boy, did they gel well as a tag team. I think people forget, when we talk about all-time great tag teams, people talk about, going back to the 80s with WWF and WCW, NWA, whatever. People, I think, don't throw enough flowers, Pat, at how great the Outsiders were as a tag team and their role in wrestling history.
Absolutely. I mean, Scott was kind of the worker of the two. He'd bump his tail off. He would sell. He would do everything he had to do. Big Kev would come in, on the hot tag, just do his thing. Just so much of their teamwork, very basic, simple stuff that just really just drew so much heat and really just helped tell their story anytime they were in the ring. And coincidentally, it also wasn't the first time that they tagged. In their previous stint in WCW, while Scott was the Diamond Stud and Kevin was Oz, they did tag briefly as well there. So there was an existing chemistry already there, but by the time, they had their WWF stints and they were back in WCW as a tag team, I mean, they were totally different and on an entirely different level. But absolutely, the Outsiders to me are one of the greatest teams of all time.
Yeah, and by the way, just looking at some of his specs, I mean, here, he was billed at 6'7", right? We always know sometimes when someone's billed at a certain height, Pat, that's always a little
gimmick height.
Sometimes gimmick heights, right? But again, most people don't know this. He was trained by the, legendary Hiro Matsuda. My goodness, we don't have enough fingers and toes to name all the great talents that Hiro Matsuda worked with in his career that he helped shape. Yeah. So definitely maybe something that people didn't know. But, another thing that was a trailblazing component about Scott Hall was, again, going back to signing with, WCW, it was the first time that a professional wrestler was getting guaranteed money. For a lot of years, and for people tuning in, Vince and other promoters pretty much, handed out, downside contracts or, a certain base salary. And it was also based on, hey, there was a certain percentage of merch sales that went to you. Regardless of that, Bischoff, maybe to some extent Scott Hall's influence or his negotiating tactics, along with Kevin Nash, I mean, they changed the business in 1996. I mean, pro wrestlers were now getting guaranteed contracts under the Ted Turner umbrella. And that changed the business forever because it sort of made promoters now rethink bargaining and when it came to contract negotiations. I think Scott Hall and Kevin Nash really don't get enough credit for helping workers get, again, I hate to use this word because, politically, I am, but it helped workers get their fair share of what they deserved when it came to income. And I think that's something that really goes under the microscope about the impact of Scott Hall.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up perfectly. He was very instrumental in creating a lot of the business side that we saw in the business, later on. And a lot of the standards, really, they were, he and Kevin Nash were some of the first guys to really implement that into their contracts and kind of just make it, commonplace for everyone. But Scott just had a great understanding for the business. He wasn't one of these guys who's going to die on a hill about winning or losing. He didn't really care about championships per se, although I'm sure he obviously, coveted being, the Intercontinental Champion, Tag Team Champion. He obviously held those belts with prestige, but, you know, he was the guy that was all about business. Hey, what's going to make the most money? What's going to make the most sense? How are me and the boys going to get paid? And guys like that, let me tell you, man, they're special and they're valuable. And I think Vince McMahon saw that and really, really capitalized on that. And I think any promoter that worked with him saw that and really capitalized on that. And, you know, those are the guys that you want to have in the trenches with you, you know, when you're in any type of battle.
Oh, absolutely. And again, you know, as we saw, again, WCW continue on. I mean, we all know the records, right? 83 weeks, not just because it's Eric Bischoff's podcast, but, you know, it was 83 straight weeks that WCW on Tuesday morning would look at the ratings provided by Nielsen.com, and they were beating Vince McMahon. And Scott Hall, again, along with Nash and Hogan, were a big part of that. As we saw throughout 96 and 97, we started seeing, to some extent, WCW get a little stale. Not Scott Hall's fault, not Hogan's. Well, maybe Hogan, who knows? I don't mind throwing shit at Hulk Hogan, but not because of Nash. And again, you started seeing the NWO kind of grow exponentially. You started seeing the transition of Sting now becoming the number one babyface. And again, it's been documented that when Steve Borden, the man known as Sting, was transitioning in 1996 into a new character, it was because of Scott Hall going up Steve Borden and Bischoff and saying, hey, why don't we change up Sting's look? Have you ever seen The Crow? And, of course, Steve Borden never had seen that film. That's the iconic role by the late Brandon Lee, the son of Bruce Lee. That's an iconic motion picture, right? It's a cult classic for a lot of people. And sure enough, like Scott Hall going to Bischoff, pushing for that, hey, let's kind of, you know, Sting's getting a little stale here. You know, if this is the guy we're going to push to, you know, defeat the NWO and defeat Hogan, let's change it up a little bit. Let's kind of change his look. And sure enough, it worked, you know. And we had a whole year-and-a-half program where Sting was chasing the NWO, and finally he defeated Hogan at Starrcade '97. Not the best match. We've all listened to podcasts. We've all read books about it. We all know it's a really flat match. But again, you know, credit to Scott Hall being that sort of creative influence to change up another guy and say, hey, listen, you're getting a little stale. Let's change you up. And let's be honest, that look for Sting has worked ever since.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it became commonplace for Sting afterwards, and it's like more of his iconic look. I mean, he ended up kind of modifying it as time went on. He kind of obviously drew different influences, you know, from kabuki, you know, the kabuki makeup as well as black metal. So yeah, I mean, that was a really awesome time, and it was exciting to watch. It really took Sting to a whole other level afterwards. I mean, it was just really, really special. And as far as it goes with, you know, things getting stale for the NWO, I mean, I got to blame booking on that. I'm not even going to throw the blame at Hogan or any of the other easy targets. I'm not going to blame any of the boys because I think they were doing what they were told. At the end of the day, though, having 50 members of this thing is really what ruined it, you know? And I feel like to some extent the Shield kind of learned from that, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like they kind of understood, like, hey, you know what? Let's keep it to this three-man group. Like, we don't need to make it this big thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's you know, and I think the best NWO was the original three guys. So yeah afterwards, you know, everything got to be a little too much, and it wore out.
No, it absolutely did. And again, when we talk about the decline of WCW, you know, we talk about that awful booking, other things, financial decisions. And as we all know, that WCW was bought out by Vince McMahon in 2001. And certainly while Vince, you know, in a lot of documentaries, right, the rise and fall of WCW, other stuff we've seen on what I believe is still the best streaming service, the WWE Network, not Peacock, but the WWE Network, those are great things to watch. And when Vince bought out WCW, there were still a lot of contracts that were still Turner/AOL/Time Warner that encompassed a lot of talent. So certainly while Vince would have loved to have brought in Scott Hall at the time and Hogan and Kevin Nash and Goldberg and others, it wasn't financially feasible for Vince. And it wasn't financially feasible for someone like Scott Hall who still had guaranteed money left on a year and a half left on a contract. So, pretty much as WCW was fizzled out, again, under the old Turner umbrella, Vince bought it. We all saw what that invasion angle was in 2001. Ideally, we would have loved to have seen some of those Time Warner contracts maybe get ripped up. But, hey, you can't blame them. If you get to sit home and make money, that's great. Vince did what he could with that angle. But let's be honest, in January of 2002, when Vince dropped that promo on SmackDown about injecting the WWF with a lethal dose of poison, everyone remembers Vince McMahon in that chair, and just, Vince with that overkill voice, Pat. You know how I feel about Vince sometimes when he just said, me and the NWO. And sure enough, we knew Scott Hall, Hulk Hogan, and Kevin Nash were coming back to the WWF in 2002. And that reception in Milwaukee during No Way Out, I'm going to tell you something. For folks who haven't watched it, go back on, God help us, the Peacock Network now, and watch that pay-per-view. Watch that pop for them when they returned. It was iconic, Patrick.
Absolutely. I mean, back in the pay-per-view days before premium live events for WWE, that was a fantastic show to watch live. Obviously, the guys were older. They weren't really the performers that they were, but the fans were into it. I mean, this was a dream scenario. And the possibilities, especially with that WWE roster at the time, I mean, they were really, really like limitless. So it was special for the fans, I think. And, seeing them come out and then just building up for that pop, that anticipation for Scott Hall to utter those two famous words. And I'm not talking about suck it. I'm talking about, hey, yo. When he let out that hey, yo, that first hey, yo, when he was back, it was incredible. And if you look at his facial expression, it almost broke him. He almost broke character because that pop was just really, really awesome. And, his WWE run, wasn't particularly great for a variety of reasons, but there were some special moments absolutely in between.
Oh, absolutely. And again, that year at WrestleMania in Toronto, wrestling Stone Cold Steve Austin, which, again, notwithstanding, and exactly. And let's be honest, when people talk about the greatest stunners in WWF/WWE history, how can anyone forget the way that Scott Hall sold the Stone Cold Stunner at WrestleMania in Toronto? I mean, he literally jumped in the air as if he was, I don't know what he was. I mean, that was the most iconic stunner that I can remember. Even outdueling The Rock, who sometimes oversold the stunners, that was the greatest stunner that I think ever delivered. And, obviously, as you mentioned, there were some problems backstage that led to Scott Hall not working anymore. From that point on, he moved on to TNA, Tone Non-Stop Action Wrestling, which would become Impact Wrestling from 2002 to 2005. Then again in 2007, 2008, he had Kevin Nash join him. And it was good, again, and me being Mr. Impact, Patrick, obviously, it was great to see Scott Hall on the secondary wrestling promotion in North America at the time, right? Him, Kevin Nash, Sean Waltman, we all know as X-Pac. Obviously, when Hogan came in 2010, it was interesting to see him there for a little bit. And then, pretty much Scott Hall kind of wrestled here and there for the next few years after leaving TNA, wrestled some other promotions. We all know the famous ESPN documentary, 30 for 30, documenting his life. And, of course, when he came back to the WWE, I mean, that was, again, it was one of those things where he was inducted into the Hall of Fame that year in New Orleans, where he gave that iconic speech, and at the end where he said, work hard, dreams come true, bad times don't last, but bad guys do. And I'll tell you something, I went back and watched that this week. It was, I got a little misty about it, because it reminded me that a part of my childhood, a part of my adolescence, part of my adulthood kind of has a void now with his passing. And I think that's how we look at Scott Hall. We look at a guy who's been in the business for 30 years, gave a lot of his life, a lot of his body, And when I watched that Hall of Fame, I have to tell you, I mean, to see that Hall of Fame speech, him there, it was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. You did botch the quote, though. It was hard work pays off, dreams come true, bad times don't last, but bad guys do. And I know because I actually wrote it down on a Post-it, and I put it on my wall at work in my office. Because it's a really comforting quote, especially dealing with adversity. And Scott Hall just came out with that Scott Hall swag, like dripping to the last drop with that white suit with the black on black tie, shirt combo, hair slicked back, toothpick in hand, flicked the toothpick at the camera, and gave, to me, in my opinion, the greatest Hall of Fame speech up until now. It was definitely an emotional thing because, I think we kind of feel like we grew up with him. And obviously, it's been very well documented, his issues outside of the ring, but I don't think that that's something that we need to talk about here. I think that's been covered enough and the dangers of it. But I just think that, it's important for us to remember Scott Hall, the performer, Scott Hall, the person who I had a chance to meet with at the big event. And take a really, really cool picture with. I think it's just important to remember his contributions to professional wrestling and the great memories that he left us with.
Oh, absolutely. And again, when we talk about memories, the year after his induction into the Hall of Fame, everyone remembers, WrestleMania 31 at some ballpark, I don't know, near San Francisco. I don't know, some ballpark there. But, some stadium.
Oh, yeah. The 49ers play there. They beat the Cowboys in Dallas. You remember that, right?
Yeah. They play at Navy Park or whatever it's called, and that America's Dump, San Francisco. That's great. Quality of life city as we call it here in the United States, folks.
Wrong podcast, pal. Wrong podcast.
I know. And it was great.
You can't help yourself.
I can't, But it was amazing to see him come out along with Hulk Hogan and Nash. Reuniting as the NWO to help Sting in his match against Triple H, who, coincidentally had DX in his corner, right? So it was, you want to talk about nostalgia. You want to talk about really getting the marks stirred up into a frenzy. Seeing, again, hearing the iconic NWO theme song and seeing Nash, Hogan, and Hall come out in gimmick and fighting with DX. It sort of reminded us like, hey, you know what, for those of us that maybe remember the Wrestling Wars, this was amazing. For those who didn't live through it, this was the closest thing to it. But I have to say that, seeing him there, seeing him at the Raw 25th anniversary at the Manhattan Center in 2018, again, coming out and, as Razor Ramon, it was amazing, and certainly in 2020, having him be inducted with his NWO stablemates, right? Kevin Nash and Hogan and Shaw Waltman. It was truly amazing. It was truly, truly amazing to see him be inducted twice. And again, a guy who enormous contribution to the business, a very loving father. We saw that, and especially with his son Cody. And when we think about Scott Hall, Patrick, we think about a guy who gave his life to professional wrestling, and a guy who, made a lot of gimmicks work, drew a lot of money, drew a lot of ratings.
Made everything work, really. Made everything work,
Made everything work, and I think to the point of, this is a guy who, again, and, people call me a Vince McMahon apologist. When he left Atlanta.
Then what am I? What am I if you're a Vince apologist?
Well, true, yeah. Well, no, you're a Vince apologist on steroids, ATH, and every other banned substance. But let's be honest. When Scott Hall had that run as the Diamond Stud, right, main events and pay-per-views, Vince, again, for all the grief we give Vince, he saw something in Scott Hall. He checked off a lot of boxes. He ran with a gimmick, marketed it well, pushed him to the moon. Again, it's a reminder that, as much as I like to really vilify Vince on social media, and more so because of the stock not being worth what it should be, and Peacock being just absolutely obnoxious to use, it's a reminder that, again, Vince's creative genius. He takes a guy who wasn't a bum, he wasn't a scrub, he wasn't a clown, he was an accomplished wrestler, and took him, packaged him in a certain way, and that took off and drew money. Again, Scott Hall had to make it work as a performer. But again, let's throw some flowers at Vince McMahon, too, who, let's be honest, helped package that guy and made him a tremendous star.
Absolutely. I think, Vince doesn't get enough credit for a lot of the things that he's done. I think people just choose to emphasize what they don't like. But, hey, watch another product if you don't like it. Times are changing and he's moving on and he's finding that new generation of fans. So, if you don't like it, watch something else. But that's for another episode. Vince saw that Scott Hall was missing that thing, just that it factor. Like he had the entire package, he just didn't have anything compelling to say. And I think Scott Hall summed it up in the Razor Ramon documentary when he said, I had everything in me. I could speak well, but I just didn't have anything to say. And with Razor Ramon, he had something to say. And Scott Hall, I think, should also serve as an example to any aspiring young wrestlers out there, any aspiring young sports entertainers out there, that having the right attitude and taking what the promoter gives you instead of complaining about it on the dirt sheets, instead of, crying about it backstage or talking smack to whoever, take it and make it work, because that's what great workers do. You can give,
absolutely.
I believe CM Punk said it before, you take chicken shit and you turn it to chicken salad. And that's what you should be able to do. And that's powerful coming from me because I'm a vegan. Take what you have and make it work for you, And that's what Scott Hall did with everything that he had.
No, absolutely. And again, he was a phenomenal worker. I think back to some of my favorite matches with Scott Hall, either as Razor Ramon or as Scott Hall. I mean, I would make the case, Pat, and I think a lot of people, probably, don't remember this, but it's easy to just, cite Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon at WrestleMania in 1984. I would argue one of my personal favorite matches was SummerSlam 1993 in Detroit. He faced the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, which would ultimately become Ted DiBiase's final wrestling match ever. Obviously, we saw that Ted DiBiase started developing some neck issues. But sure enough, that match, and for everyone listening to this podcast today, go back on Peacock. Again, navigate through the 75,000 ads that you have to go through to watch a pay-per-view. But, watch
or
that
upgrade
match.
Your subscription and stop being cheap. You could do that too.
Well, I could do that too, yes. But, folks, we watched that match against Ted DiBiase at SummerSlam 1983 in Detroit. One of my favorite matches of his. I would argue, believe it or not, that, in 1995 at the Royal Rumble, despite, losing to Jeff Jarrett, that was one of his best matches too. He was a great worker. I mean, I can never really think of a bad match, of
his match with Brett
career. Yeah, at the Royal Rumble in 1983. Now, in terms of a bad match, I wouldn't say the match was bad. I just didn't like the premise. I wasn't a fan of what Bischoff was doing in 1998 with him. I didn't like the fact of invoking his personal problems into an angle. I get it, whatever. There have to be willing accomplices. If Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were good with it, who am I to say anything? I just didn't like invoking stuff like that into a storyline. I thought it was in poor taste by Bischoff to do that with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, invoking some things, and I was never a fan of that. That was probably, I would say, my least favorite match of his. Not because of the match quality. I think, again, he was a great worker working with Nash. They had great chemistry going back to the WWF days. Just not a fan of Bischoff doing that to Scott Hall and invoking things that, quite frankly, I don't think should be out there for public consumption. But that's me, man.
Agreed. I thought it was in poor taste too. I think it was, cheap heat. And, I get that they were also in a time where, you could kind of do something like that and get away with it. And obviously Scott and Kevin were cool about it, but yeah, I'm with you. Not something that I would want to see done. Although it has been done many years later in wrestling as well.
And let's be fair, like 2 years earlier, like during SummerSlam 96, I mean, Jerry Lawler invoked some things about Jake the Snake Roberts. So it's not the first time we've got to see that in a pro wrestling angle. Again, just in poor taste. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was necessary. But again, that's probably my least favorite match I can remember about Scott Hall, because I just didn't like Bischoff doing that to him. And I thought that, again, maybe they all agreed to it, but I just didn't like it. I thought it was not something that should be on television, not because I'm some uptight, conservative that doesn't like to address these things in public consumption. I just thought that for pro wrestling, there was no need for that. But that's just me, Pat.
Absolutely. And also I'd like to add to that if anybody's listening to this show right now and you are battling addiction, whether it's alcohol, drugs, anything else, gambling, get help. There's people out there that love you. There's people out there that care about you, and they want you to be around. And, if you're suffering in any type of way, get help. Get help. Your life is worth living, no matter how bad it might seem.
Well said there, man. Well said. And folks, when we think about Scott Hall, again, an iconic character, and I don't mean just because of the gimmick, a character in his own right, where he was so influential in helping younger workers. I mean, maybe people don't know this, but, back in 2016, he was backstage, and it was one of the first people to greet Zack Ryder after he won the Intercontinental Championship at Cowboy Stadium at WrestleMania. And he, again, was a guy that loved to talk to younger stars, be as influential and as helpful. And you know what? For a guy that, came up in the business, could have had a huge ego, everything we've read about Scott Hall, podcasts we've seen, shoot interviews, he always came across as a really humble guy, a guy who was grateful for everything he got in the business. And I'll be honest with you, man, he's a guy we're going to miss, because I think of his sincerity and how genuine he was. I think he was one of the more transparent personalities in the history of professional wrestling, Pat.
Absolutely. It came across on the screen, and that's why it was so easy to believe whatever he would say, whether it was him portraying a Cuban character, him, being a part of a hostile takeover, whatever it was that they gave this guy, he made it work. And there was a lot of sincerity there, and it really came across. And again, I'm privileged to, and I thank you for actually taking me to that Mark event, because I don't really like to go to those Mark events at all, as you know. But to be able to be there, to talk with him, to take a picture with him, and more importantly, to be able to just thank him, for all of his great contributions, and to, tell him that I felt like he was one of the most underrated guys ever. It was really cool. And just to see how humble he was, how thankful he was, it was truly special. And Scott Hall will certainly be missed, not just by his loved ones, but by the entire wrestling world. And it was a very sad day indeed.
It really was. And all this week in different wrestling shows, we saw tributes to Scott Hall. We saw it on Monday Night Raw. Subsequently, he had passed actually during Raw, during the actual 3-hour show. Yeah. We did see the end. Well, I mean, because I watched the NWA on YouTube, the National Wrestling Alliance did have an homage to Scott Hall and his contributions. I know All Elite Wrestling on Wednesday had mentioned it briefly. Last night on Impact, during their 2-hour show every Thursday night from 8 to 10 on Access TV, they did mention also the passing of Scott Hall. So, again, I'm sure they'll do that later tonight when SmackDown is live. I don't know where it is, but I'm sure they'll have a great homage to him. Again, a great guy that we're going to miss in the business. And, he's one of the more prominent members of the Attitude Era. Kind of helped start the Attitude Era, kind of this era of realism. Because there were a lot of things, Pat, during the summer of '96 that kind of made you suspend disbelief for a little bit when it came to pro wrestling. And Scott Hall was instrumental in that. So I'm just grateful I got to watch him, got to meet him at that event as well. And, I say this to all my friends who are pro wrestling fans. Whenever you can go to these events, again, there's WrestleCon coming up in May in Morristown, New Jersey, and I think a couple other events coming up. Whenever you can go to them and meet some of these old-time wrestlers, the reason I love going is just meeting them, because you never know when they're going to pass. And I just want to have the experience of being able to talk with them and just thank them as a fan. So that's why I always find those events kind of helpful for me.
Absolutely, and I was totally no selling the whole thing until I found out Scott Hall was going to be there, and I was like, okay, that's what sold me. That's absolutely what sold me. So yeah, I mean, look, I rag on it, but it's great for fans, it's great for the boys, it's great for the girls, and it's I think it's important for them to understand how truly appreciated they were, especially those guys that wrestled during that time that Scott did, because those guys were out on the road a lot, and they were machines.
Yep.
And, it's important to tell them, how much of an impact they had on you and, what the memories they provided. It's absolutely important. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you're out 250, 300 days a year touring, house shows, public appearances. For anybody, again, folks, go on YouTube. Check out his appearance in 1994 on the Jerry Springer Show when he talked to two kids diagnosed with AIDS, and he got them front row tickets, I believe, for WrestleMania. It was unbelievable, like the compassion, the humanity that Scott Hall demonstrated, not just as a pro wrestler, but doing these things as a pop culture icon. I think he's going to be missed. And again,
he even gave one of the kids his Intercontinental title.
That's right. Yep, that's right. So again, folks, if you haven't seen that on YouTube, definitely Google it. It's a heartwarming moment, and again, it's a reminder of how humane he was and how much of a people person Scott Hall was. So again, my condolences to his family. May he rest in peace, and he's finally at peace now. He's had a rough life in recent years, but hopefully he can rest now, and we're going to try to honor his memory by doing podcasts like this and really honoring his contributions, Pat. To say the least, it's something that it still stings. I'll think about, obviously, it's still very, very heavy on my mind this week.
Absolutely. I watched a lot of his old stuff, and, things that I might have even forgotten, because it's been so long, and it was just great. It was just fantastic to revisit it. And, Kevin Nash obviously wrote a really heartfelt tribute. And one of the parts that really stood out to me was when he said, we're not saying goodbye to the bad guy. We're saying goodbye to the great guy. And Scott Hall was a great guy, and he will be missed dearly. Rest in peace, Scott Hall.
He really, really was. And folks, we're going to leave it right there. And I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, remembering Scott Hall and honoring his legacy. And really, I hope you've enjoyed this, what I would argue, a great chronological detail of his life and his career. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Folks, we'll be coming to you next week. Again, we'll be pre-recording, and we'll be giving you a preview of WrestleMania, the most stupendous WrestleMania in the history of WWE. It's a word that I think Vince, came across maybe in a drunken stupor, reading up the stars, and say, you know what, we don't use this word enough, and let's use it to describe the Super Bowl of professional wrestling / sports entertainment, folks. We're going to have a great breakdown next week here on Working the Marks as WrestleMania emanates from the world-famous Cowboy Stadium in glorious Dallas, Texas, the most stupendous WrestleMania two-night event. We're going to break it down for you folks. A lot to talk about with this very exciting card. And, hey, listen, I think we'll have a lot to talk about. And, again, folks, we hope you've enjoyed this special edition of Working the Marks as we remember the life and legacy of Scott Hall, one of the best workers ever in the history of professional wrestling. So, Pat, any closing thoughts here as we're about to close the show?
Just want to say thanks, Profe, as always. It was great to reminisce and to pay our respects to a fantastic worker, a great person, and again, somebody who will be sorely missed by a lot of people. Looking forward to covering the most stupendous WrestleMania of all time. And we'll be back with you next week. Take care, folks, as always, and be safe.
Folks, he is New Jersey's premier wrestling analyst. I'll even say journalist, too. Patrick Rivera.
Yeah.
I'm New Jersey's premier journalist, obviously a whole different world. I'm Fernando Uribe, folks. I want to thank you so much for for joining us here on Working the Marks. Don't forget, folks, if you like the show, obviously do us a favor, like it on Facebook. For those of us that still subscribe to Facebook, right? Hey, click a like on there. Make sure you shoot us an email to our inbox, workingthemarks@gmail.com. Also, follow us on Instagram at working_the_marks. And also hit us up on Twitter, ladies and gentlemen, at working_marks. Hey, our social media is growing. We're seeing some nice listens here on the show. Without you, our loyal fans, again, this would not be possible. So, folks, I want to thank you for joining us here on a special edition of Working the Marks as we honor the life of Scott Hall, one of the best workers and best people in the history of professional wrestling. Folks, we'll see you next week here on Working the Marks on Blog Talk Radio. Don't forget to download the episodes and share them on your social media. Once again, www.blogtalkradio.com/workingthemarks. And again, we'll see you next week here as we preview WrestleMania, the Super Bowl of professional wrestling / sports entertainment here, once again, folks, on Blog Talk Radio. Have a great one, folks.
Stupendous!
Famcast Media.